When Hitler launched the Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Europe was already engulfed in war, but the far north still seemed like a world apart, a white desert of ice, silence, and death. It was there, in the frozen lands of Finland, that an alliance as cold as the weather itself was sealed. Finland was still bleeding from winter war of 1939-1940 when she faced the Soviet Union alone. Even resisting heroically, she lost precious territories such as Karelia, leaving hundreds of thousands of Finns homeless. Entire families were driven from their lands. Villages disappeared under the Soviet occupation. The wound was open, and the anger frozen in the cold. When Hitler turned his attention to the east, promising to destroy Soviet communism, the Finns saw an opportunity there. It wasn't an alliance based on ideology, era revenge, survival and reclaiming territory. No romantic speeches, just a necessity. The Finnish government did not see itself as a Nazi ally, but as a co-belligerent, a temporary partner driven by a common enemy. And this enemy was gigantic. While the Germans prepared millions of soldiers to invade the USSR, in Northern Europe the bases began to move silently. German troops landed in Lapland in the far north of Finland. They were soldiers from the mountain troops, trained to fight in impossible terrain. They arrived by train, in convoys, in columns of trucks that roared through the snow, grey uniforms contrasting with the endless white of the Arctic. But they quickly realized something. They weren't arriving on a battlefield. They were entering a frozen tomb. Finland, with its frozen lakes, dense forests, and temperatures that could crush any human being, was not just a country. It was a testing ground of nature itself. The German and Finnish commandos drew their lines on the map. The plan was to advance together against Soviet forces and recover lost territories. And for Germany to go much further, to cut the great artery of the Soviet North. But while officers sketched out strategies on illuminated tables, outside the wind sliced faces like invisible blades. The ice crackled beneath the soldiers' feet. The silence of the snow was not peace. It was the silence before death. And so, while the rest of Europe burned in fire, cannons and ruins, a different war was brewing in the north. A war without color, no heat, without mercy. It wouldn't just be a battle against men. It would be a battle against one's self, winter. And that agreement, that union between Germany and Finland, it wasn't just politics. It was a pact sealed beneath the ice. And ice, like war, spares no one. Subscribe and join the front line of history. While Europe crumbled under the weight of cannons and ruins, Hitler fixed his gaze on something that most couldn't even point out on a map. Murmansk, a cold, distant, almost unreal city, nestled in the far north of the Soviet Union. For many, it was just a forgotten point in the Arctic. For Hitler, it was an open artery, a vital passage through which flowed everything that kept the Soviets standing. Through that port, which never froze even in the harshest winters, arrived convoys from the Western Allies. British and American ships crossed seas infested with submarines and storms to deliver weapons, tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, clothing and vehicles. Each crate unloaded in Murmansk meant better equipped Soviet soldiers, tanks returning to combat, and front lines holding firm. And Hitler knew if that northern gateway were closed, the Soviet Union would feel the blow. That's where the plan was born. A cold, direct, and merciless plan, like the Arctic climate itself. Advance through northern Finland, break through Soviet defenses, cut the Murmansk railway, the vital line connecting the port to the rest of the country, and finally, take the city itself. Without this connection, Murmansk would become just an isolated body, surrounded by ice, incapable of sustaining the Soviet war effort. But there was something that Berlin's calculations failed to capture. No German map could show what it truly meant to fight there. The terrain was no ordinary battlefield. There were no proper roads, only narrow trails sunk in mud in the summer, and turned into strips of ice in the winter. The ground was hard as stone, covered in moss, frozen swamps, dense pine forests, and treacherous rivers hidden beneath the snow. With every kilometer advanced, the soldiers had to fight not only the enemy, but nature itself. The German mountain troops, these women hand-picked for this mission, began their march north through Norway and Finnish Lapland. They were men trained for difficult terrain, but even they were not prepared for what they would find. The wind cut their skin like razors. The snow erased entire paths at night. Temperatures plummeted to levels that made metal stick to their hands. Engine oil froze, weapons jammed, radios failed, and each failure cost lives. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Soviets were not standing still. They knew Murmansk was vital. They knew the Germans were coming, and they knew that white hell like the back of their hand. Soviet units, trained for warfare in extreme weather, dug defensive positions into the rock and frozen earth, camouflaged their shelters with snow, prepared supply lines hidden among the trees, and positioned artillery at strategic points where the enemy advance would be forced to pass. It wasn't a defense based solely on weapons, but on patience. They knew that in the Arctic, time was a weapon. Each extra day of cold, each night under the snow, each kilometer of hostile terrain wore the Germans down more than any bullet. In Berlin, Murmansk still seemed like just a strategic objective, a red dot drawn on the map. In reports, it was an operation. In speeches, it was a promise. But in the northern ice, Hitler's dream was slowly beginning to creak, like ice under pressure, about to shatter. Because there, even before the first large-scale shot was fired, the German army was already waging an invisible battle against fatigue, cold, distance, and the very illusion that it could dominate the Arctic. And as the German columns advanced, under grey skies and winds that howled like ghosts, Murmansk remained there motionless, frozen, waiting, not like a defenseless prey, but like a silent trap, ready to swallow anyone who dared approach. Operation Silber Fox, the invasion of the Arctic. When the plan took shape, it was given a name that sounded almost elegant, Operation Silberfuchs, the Silver Fox. But there was nothing gentle about that offensive, only ice, steel, and the dull glint of death waiting in the snow. The operation began in the summer of 1941, shortly after the start of Operation Barbarossa. While millions of German soldiers advanced through the heart of the Soviet Union, in the far north, a smaller but highly trained army set out towards the impossible, crossing the Arctic and breaking Soviet resistance in one of the most inhospitable regions on the planet. On the German side were mainly the mountain troops. Hardened men, veterans of previous campaigns, accustomed to difficult terrain, but not to what awaited them there. Alongside them, Finnish units, who knew those icy lands like no other. They could read the snow, feel the wind, predict the weather. But not even this knowledge made the mission any less cruel. The plan was divided into two major fronts. One would advance north from Norway directly towards Murmansk, the other through central Lapland towards Kandalaksha, attempting to cut the vital railway line connecting Murmansk to the rest of the USSR. If they succeeded in severing this line, the Soviets in the Arctic would be isolated, without supplies, without reinforcements, without hope. But in the very first days of Operation Silberfuchs, reality began to take its toll. The German and Finnish columns advanced along almost non-existent roads, makeshift trails over terrain that alternated between hard rock, deep mud, and swamps disguised as firm ground. Vehicles got stuck up to their axles. Trucks had to be pulled by exhausted men, in rain, wind and temperatures that plummeted even outside of the dead of winter. At night, the temperature dropped brutally. The body did not rest. Sleep came lightly, interrupted by the cold, the dampness, the fear. Soaked clothes froze. Boots became as hard as stone. Skin cracked, hands trembled. Many soldiers discovered there that fighting in the Arctic was like waging war inside a giant freezer, where everything conspires to slow you down and then kill you. But it wasn't just the weather. The Soviets were already there. They destroyed bridges, mined paths, ambushed columns, and disappeared into the white forest like ghosts. Small groups would appear out of nowhere, fire, retreat, and vanish into the icy vastness. Sometimes the German soldiers would shoot at shadows, at distant silhouettes, without even properly seeing the enemy's faces. Even so, the order was clear: move forward, no matter the cost. German officers were receiving increasingly worrying reports. The pace of the offensive was too slow. Losses were beginning to mount. Physical and mental exhaustion was growing, but the pressure from above was relentless. Berlin would not accept excuses such as, "the cold is too intense." For Hitler, the North had to fall as the rest had fallen. But the North wasn't France, it wasn't Poland, it wasn't even Stalingrad. It was a separate world, a war within the ice. And as Operation Silberfuchs slowly advanced across the tundra, the wind howled through the frozen trees as if announcing what was to come. Because the truth was beginning to reveal itself day after day, step by step. The Arctic was not being invaded. He was, little by little, devouring its invaders. 4. Terrain as an enemy, tundra, swamps, and the impossible advance. From the very first kilometers, the German and Finnish soldiers realized they weren't just facing men. They were facing the very ground beneath their feet. The Arctic terrain was no passive backdrop. It was a living, silent, cruel enemy. There were no real roads. What existed were makeshift trails, dirt paths that in summer turned into deep mud and in winter into treacherous patches of slippery ice. The tundra, with its shallow, waterlogged soil, swallowed entire vehicles as if they were toys. Trucks got stuck up to their axles. Cannons had to be disassembled and carried by exhausted men. Each advance of a few kilometers took hours, sometimes days. The swamps, hidden beneath low vegetation or covered by a thin layer of ice, were deadly traps. One wrong step and the soldier would sink. In many cases it was impossible to rescue those who fell. Under the weight of their equipment, the frozen mud became a silent tomb. And the space didn't help at all. The vastness of the north was deceptive. From afar, everything seemed flat, open, easy. But in practice, it was a labyrinth without landmarks, endless forests, rocky hills, frozen rivers that cracked under the weight. The compass alone was not enough. Many soldiers got lost in the white landscape without reference points, without clear roads, without villages every few kilometers like in Central Europe. On one side, dense forest. On the other side, a frozen swamp. Ahead, white fog. And behind, only emptiness. The Germans, accustomed to fast, mechanized campaigns based on roads and speed, saw their greatest advantage simply dissolve. Tanks could barely operate. Artillery had difficulty being positioned. Logistics, the heart of any army, began to fail. And without supplies, there is no army. Food was slow to arrive. Ammunition came in dribs and drabs. Fuel became as precious as gold. Soldiers spent entire days with frozen rations, which had to be broken open with bayonets before they could be eaten. Drinking, water was a challenge. The ice needed to be melted, but the fuel for that was becoming increasingly scarce. Meanwhile, the Soviets used that terrain as if it were an extension of their own bodies. They knew where the ground gave way. They knew which hills offered the best views. They knew which trails were safe and which led to death. Ambushes were prepared in natural bottlenecks, narrow passages between rocks and forests where the Germans had very little mobility. And gradually, the offensive began to slow down, not for lack of courage, not for lack of weapons, but that's because the Arctic itself was imposing its own rhythm. Each step cost more. Every meter was torn from the ground with sweat, blood, and exhaustion. The soldiers were no longer just fighting invisible Soviets among the trees. They were fighting to stay on their feet, to keep moving, to avoid getting lost, to avoid freezing during the night. And while the commanders, on the maps, still marked arrows advancing towards Murmansk, the men in the field knew the truth. The advance was not being stopped by an enemy line, but for a world that did not want to be conquered. The defenders of the north, the Red Army, resists in the ice. Imagine a world where white is not purity, but a deadly veil that suffocates the soul. In the vast and merciless north, where the wind howls like lost souls and the ice clings to flesh like an insatiable predator, the Soviet defenders of the Red Army were not mere soldiers. They were specters forged in the cruel forge of Siberia itself. These men, born of the frozen steppes and forgotten tundras, did not tremble before the icy embrace of the Arctic. For them, the ice was not a treacherous enemy, but an ancient ally, a silent companion that shaped their lives from the cradle. They breathed the biting air as if it were the nectar of survival, and their hearts beat to the slow, inexorable rhythm of eternal winter. Unlike the massive hordes the Soviets unleashed on the eastern plains, here in the north, numbers were scarce, like solitary flakes in an endless blizzard. Resources were limited. Men counted on frozen fingers, vehicles creaking under the weight of the frost, roads that looked more like open wounds in the frozen earth, and supplies arriving like drops of mercy in a snow desert. But oh, the frustration of the German and Finnish invaders when they discovered that quantity didn't matter. These defenders compensated with a profane intimacy with the environment, an ancestral wisdom that transformed the white chaos into an invisible fortress. Many had grown up in remote villages where the cold was the first teacher, imparting brutal lessons: how to walk on snow without sinking, how to conserve body heat like a stolen treasure, how to survive when the whole world conspired to bury you alive. Their clothing was armor against the abyss, heavy coats woven from thick wool, and animal hides that once roamed those wild lands, felt-lined boots that defied the deadly embrace of the ice, and masks that concealed faces hardened by the wind, making them indistinguishable from the landscape. Camouflaged in immaculate white, they emerged from the snowy shadows like vengeful ghosts, attacking in small, lethal packs, their silhouettes dissolving into the forests before the echo of gunfire could betray their presence. The terror they instilled was palpable. A German, exhausted and trembling, gazed at the empty horizon, only to be cut down by a burst of gunfire that seemed to come from nowhere, from the wind itself. Soviet defensive positions were not grandiose. They were subtle traps, chosen with the cunning of native predators. Natural bottlenecks where enemy advance was inevitable. Narrow valleys squeezed between rocks as sharp as prey, treacherous passages alongside frozen rivers that could crack at any moment, makeshift trails leading to disguised abysses. There, every square meter was transformed into a private hell, a labyrinth of pain and despair. Bunkers dug into the ice-hardened earth, reinforced with twisted logs, irregular stones and snow compacted into natural concrete. Trenches that merged into the landscape, invisible until it was too late. Observers, enveloped in layers of insulation, endured endless hours in temperatures that would make an ordinary man beg for death, their eyes as watchful as those of hungry crows, awaiting the exact moment to unleash chaos. And they waited, with a patience bordering on sadism. They didn't waste a single bullet. They didn't reveal their positions prematurely, allowing the enemy columns to approach, swollen with false confidence, until the point of no return was crossed. Then, the oppressive silence was shattered. Machine guns spat fire and lead into the icy air, tearing flesh and dreams with equal ferocity. Mortars thundered, raising columns of snow, earth and human fragments in volcanic eruptions of horror. Rifles crackled like bones breaking in the skeletal forests, echoing an eternal lament. The Germans, already torn apart by the merciless climate and treacherous terrain, were pushed into an abyss of suffocation, their cries muffled by the wind, their hopes frozen in mid-air. But the Soviet strategy transcended mere resistance. It was a calculated attrition, a slow and inexorable erosion of the enemy's will. They understood that they didn't need glittering victories, only time. To impede the advance, to trap the invaders in a web of ice and scarcity, to let the cold consume supplies, energy, and above all, morale. Each day that dragged on was a silent victory. Vehicles abandoned like empty hulls, bodies stiffened in grotesque postures by the ice, men trembling under inadequate uniforms, their faces contorted in masks of frustration and terror. The Soviets watched, impassive, knowing that time was their cruelest ally. As winter approached like a stealthy predator, extending its icy fingers across the north, the defenders of Murmansk remained. Unwavering, they did not retreat, they did not falter, they resisted with a tenacity that inspired dread. For there, in that kingdom where the sun hid for weeks on end, plunging the world into a suffocating darkness, they were not fighting merely for a remote city. They were fighting for a lifeline, for every ship that might still dock with life-saving supplies, for every inch of land that separated hope from the abyss. If Murmansk fell, the entire north would be swallowed by eternal darkness, a void where dreams and lives would dissolve into merciless ice. Fear hung in the air. What would remain if these guardians failed? Only the silence of the dead and the howling of the wind, echoing the frustration of an endless war. Rovaniemi in flames, the scorched earth in the Arctic. When the capricious and treacherous tides of war began to turn against Germany in the dark twilight of 1944, Finland, caught in a web of fragile alliances, was compelled to sign a peace agreement with the Soviet Union, a pact that traded salvation for new damnation. Peace with Moscow was no balm. It was a declaration of war against former allies, the Germans who had once marched shoulder to shoulder. Thus erupted the Lapland War, a fratricidal hunt in the frozen heart of the north, where brothers in arms became mortal enemies under the oppressive grey sky. Consumed by a volcanic fury, Hitler ordered not a dignified retreat, but total annihilation, a scorched earth that would leave only ashes and desolation for the traitors. Rovaniemi, the urban jewel of northern Finland, once an oasis of life amidst the white vastness, was transformed into an apocalyptic scene, a blazing inferno that defied the very essence of the Arctic. The Germans, in their retreating fury, set everything ablaze with demonic meticulousness. Centuries-old wooden houses crackled and collapsed in towers of devouring flames. Barns exploded in clouds of sparks. Roads were dynamited into smoking craters. Bridges toppled. Like fallen giants, warehouses erupted in infernos that consumed vital supplies. Nothing would be left behind. The fire, fueled by the Arctic wind that howled like a possessed demon, spread its flames like a biblical plague, staining the snow a bloody, suffocating red. The terror was visceral. Civilians, torn from their precarious lives, fled in blind panic, dragging meager belongings on makeshift sleds that creaked over the treacherous ice. Women carried crying children in their arms, while the sky reddened like an open wound, reflecting the despair in their eyes. Men who once shared campfires and stories now faced each other in silent ambushes, amidst charred forests and ruins that exhaled acrid smoke. The smell of burnt wood permeated the air, mixing with the metallic stench of gunpowder and the nauseating odor of death, a cocktail that invaded the nostrils and corroded the soul. Lapland, already an inhospitable land where life clung by a thread, was reduced to a black, barren desert covered in layers of ash that mingled with the snow like a funereal shroud. Smoke hung like ghosts obscuring the horizon, while spontaneous explosions of abandoned ammunition echoed in the dark night like demonic laughter. It was no longer an organized battlefront. It was a frozen graveyard where the living envied the dead. The survivors' frustration was palpable. Why so much destruction? Why transform a home into a blazing void? Fear settled deep, whispering that hell was not in the U-team afterlife, but there, in the ice that now smouldered with the flames of human betrayal. The hunt on ice. Finns pushed the Germans into nowhere. Now the roles were reversed in a macabre dance of revenge and despair, where allies became hunters and prey in the icy belly of the Arctic. The Finns, tempered by years of winter warfare that had molded them into unbreakable warriors, launched a relentless pursuit, pushing the German forces further and further north towards Norway and the wildest, most inhuman regions of the continent, a white void where civilization dissolved into nothing. This was no conventional pursuit, with paved roads and clean strategies. It was a primal hunt on the ice, a ritual of terror where predator merged with prey in a cycle of endless pain. The Germans did not flee by familiar paths. Those had been obliterated in their own fury. Instead, they stumbled along precarious trails over glaciers that creaked like ancient bones, frozen forests where bare trees stood like dead sentinels, and swamps hidden beneath treacherous layers of snow that swallowed men whole. Trucks bogged down in white abysses, abandoned like cursed relics. Tanks, once machines of destruction, became rusty iron monuments, frozen in postures of defeat. Horses, faithful companions, succumbed to the cold, freezing standing like grotesque statues of agony. The Finns, supreme masters of combat in extreme climates, employed squadrons on skis that glided through the snow with the lethal grace of shadows. They would appear out of nowhere, attack with surgical precision, a burst here, a grenade there, and disappear among the skeletal trees, leaving behind fallen Germans, their bodies contorted in expressions of shock and frustration, unable to comprehend the source of their deaths. The cold, now a merciless equalizer, chose no sides. On nights where the temperature plunged to 30 degrees Celsius or below, men would fall asleep for fatal moments and never awaken, their bodies hardening into cocoons of ice. Skin cracked like ancient parchment, fingers darkened and fell off like rotten fruit. The wounded agonized without help, without hospitals, only the ice as their bed and silence as their companion. The German retreat transformed into a march of frozen ghosts, a spectral column dissolving into the white void of the Arctic, leaving a trail of abandoned equipment, bodies buried by the merciless snow, and a war that stubbornly persisted like an eternal curse. Terror grew with each step, the fear of being the next to fall, the frustration of an endless escape, the dread that nothingness would swallow them whole. There, in the heart of the ice, humanity revealed itself as fragile, a whisper lost in the howling wind, the invisible enemy, the cold, that killed more than bullets. If bullets could claim a life in a fleeting instant, the cold was a patient killer, an invisible spectre that devoured little by little, hour by hour, day by day, until nothing remained but an empty echo of despair. In the Arctic, the human enemy was secondary. The true predator was the environment, a primal force that hunted without mercy, without flag, without remorse. The German soldiers, arrogant in their initial invasion, discovered too late the cruelty of the far northern winter. Not a passing cold, but a constant presence, a torment that penetrated to the bone and beyond. Unlike the Eastern Front, where the ice was intense but intermittent, here it was an absolute tyrant, plummeting, temperatures below 40 degrees Celsius, with winds that cut like ethereal blades, tearing coats, flesh and sanity. Weapons, symbols of human power, betrayed their owners. Oil froze in the mechanisms, turning rifles into useless clubs. Machine guns jammed with a defeated screech. Grenades refused to explode, inert as frozen stones. Trucks stopped abruptly in the middle of nowhere, engines petrified like hearts stopped forever. But the true horror resided within the bodies, where the cold wove its web of agony. Soldiers awoke with black, hardened feet, gangrene devouring living tissue in an inexorable march. Brutal amputations were performed in the virgin snow without anesthesia, with blunt saws wielded by trembling hands, screams echoing in the void, only to be swallowed by the merciless wind. Noses collapsed like sandcastles, ears disappeared in flakes of pain, men howled in torment that transcended language. And sleep, oh, sleep was the ultimate traitor. A moment of weakness was enough. Sitting in the snow for a few seconds longer, closing one's eyes against crushing fatigue, and the body succumbed silently, without drama, without glory. Just another corpse covered by the white mantle, a victim of the invisible enemy. The cold rose like an autonomous army, indifferent to nations or causes, freezing Germans, Finns and Soviets with equal ferocity. In that land where the sun eclipsed for weeks, plunging the world into an oppressive darkness, many were swallowed by the abyss, by the darkness that corroded the mind, by the ice that stole vital warmth, by human insignificance before the cruel vastness. Terror was constant, the fear that the next breath would be the last, the frustration of fighting an enemy that could not be seen or defeated, the dread that death would come not in battle, but in an icy whisper, the collapse in the Arctic, when the highest arrogance turned to ice. Up to that point, the Northern Front had transcended the scope of a military operation. It was a cataclysmic collapse, a crumbling of human ambition under the crushing weight of eternal ice. What Hitler had envisioned as a mere secondary incursion, a footnote in his grandiose symphony of conquest, had revealed itself to be one of the most fatal errors of his era of madness. Empty promises echoing in misinterpreted maps, an arrogance that defied the gods of nature and paid the price in frozen blood. German troops lay isolated on an archipelago of despair, supply routes from northern Norway, stretching like tenuous, dangerous threads, constantly severed by sneak attacks. Convoys were torn apart in ambushes, planes battled storms that tossed them about like dead leaves, food evaporated in dwindling rations, ammunition became as scarce as distant echoes, fuel became a myth more precious than ancient legends. Soldiers subsisted on frozen crumbs, meat from horses mercifully slaughtered, and a despair that corroded the soul like acid. Without supplies, without shelter, without support, collapse was inevitable. Men abandoned their positions in silent panic, entire units fragmented like cracked ice. Officers lost control in a chaos of ignored orders. Discipline, once the unshakable pillar of the Wehrmacht, crumbled under the suffocating pressure of cold and hunger, transforming warriors into trembling shadows. There was no more glory, only the primal struggle for survival. Letters never sent, yellowed by the icy damp, snow-soaked photos held against their chests like broken talismans, promises whispered in the wind, broken forever. Morale plummeted like an abyss, the dream of northern domination metamorphosing into a white nightmare, where every step was a battle against the infinite void. There, in the frozen forests of Lapland, the arrogance of the Third Reich confronted the unshakable, a force that could not be bombarded, conquered, or commanded. Nature, impassive and eternal, did not obey dictators or empires. It simply existed, and in its indifference, devoured everything. The ultimate terror was the recognition of futility, the fear that all the struggle was in vain, the frustration of a war lost not to men, but to the merciless ice, the dread that humanity, in all its presumption, was mere dust in the Arctic wind, the road of ghosts. The final retreat to Norway. Imagine a vast, merciless white expanse, where the horizon is lost in an eternal mist of snow and ice, and the air carries the weight of an oppressive silence, broken only by the spectral howl of the polar wind that seems to whisper promises of death. In the bleak autumn of 1944, after the Finnish armistice with the Soviet Union in September, an agreement forced by the exhaustion of years of war and Soviet pressure that included the expulsion of German forces from Finnish territory, what remained of the once proud Wehrmacht divisions in northern Finland was no longer a cohesive and disciplined army, but a fragmented column of broken, starving survivors, frozen to the bone. These men, once reluctant allies of the Finns in the continuation war against the Soviets since 1941, were now being pushed out of a country they had considered a strategic bastion, a vital route for the nickel ore of Petsamo and access to the port of Murmansk. The only viable escape route snaked west and north toward Norway, occupied by the Nazis since the 1940 invasion, a land that promised refuge but delivered only more Arctic desolation. This retreat, historically known as Operation Birke and later integrated into Operation Nordlicht, did not resemble an organized march of soldiers. It was a grim procession of the undead, a procession of lost souls dragging themselves through a white hell that devoured human dignity drop by drop. The roads, already precarious in peacetime, were now destroyed by the fury of the scorched earth imposed by Hitler in retaliation for Finnish treason, bridges dynamited in explosions that echoed like distant thunder, leaving impassable abysses over half-frozen rivers, railway tracks reduced to twisted and crumpled iron, as if invisible giants had contorted them in fits of rage, and where human paths failed, only the unforgiving tundra remained, dense forests of pine trees twisted by the eternal wind, and endless white fields that swallowed footprints as if the very soil conspired to erase the existence of these intruders. Trucks, overloaded with the remnants of scarce supplies, broke down one after another under the weight of the accumulated ice, turning into frozen scrap metal that marked the path like makeshift tombstones. Heavy cannons, once symbols of military might, were abandoned to the elements, their mute mouths pointing to the grey sky in a gesture of surrender. Tanks, the formidable panzers that had roared across the European plains, were left behind, slowly covered by the snow that transformed them into rusty steel tombs, silent monuments to human arrogance. The soldiers, reduced to trembling shadows of their former selves after months of intermittent fighting against the Finns who pursued them with skis and swift ambushes, marched for endless days, sometimes entire weeks, in temperatures that plummeted below 30°C, a cold that penetrated like invisible needles, freezing the sweat on their skin and turning each breath into a searing pain that burned their lungs like icy fire. Every step was a burning agony, their feet swollen and blackened by gangrene treading on snow that sank like quicksand, forcing them to fight not only against the enemy, but against their own betraying bodies. Many carried wounded or frozen comrades on their backs, in acts of desperate camaraderie bordering on insane heroism, until exhaustion completely overwhelmed them, until they simply dropped the human burden and moved on, not daring to look back for fear of confronting the terror of accumulated loss. Familiar faces now hardened in masks of ice, eyes glazed in eternal astonishment. The surrounding landscape was a polar desert of utter terror, a void where human life seemed a blasphemous intrusion, an oppressive and deafening silence, broken only by the mournful sound of the wind howling like condemned souls and the rhythmic crunch of boots sinking into the deep snow, a sound that echoed in the mind like an execution drum. No birds cut through the grey sky, no animal life ventured into that white abyss, only human columns slowly dissolving into nothingness, their silhouettes diminishing until they merged into the infinite horizon. Some did not perish from Finnish bullets whizzing from distant ambushes. They died of sheer exhaustion, their bodies giving way after forced marches that consumed their last reserves of energy. Others succumbed to gradual freezing, hypothermia that began with uncontrollable shivering and ended in a fatal sleep where the heart stopped without warning, and others still, consumed by the overwhelming frustration of a senseless war, simply gave up, sitting in the snow to await the final embrace of the ice, their spirits broken by a campaign that had promised glory but delivered only misery. These winding roads leading out of Finland, crossing the Norwegian border at remote points like the Tana River or the Kautokeino Mountains, became known among the soldiers themselves as ghost roads, haunted trails where men had left behind not only their rusty machines and useless weapons, but often their very souls, fragments of humanity lost in the polar wind. Terror settled in deeply. The fear that the next step would be the last, the frustration of a retreat that exposed the futility of years of fighting, the dread that the Arctic would reclaim them as its own, burying them in a white grave where not even their names would be remembered. There, at the edge of the world, history was written not in victories but in footprints erased by the eternal snow. The forgotten North, a front without glory, only survival. While the world's eyes were fixed on the titanic battles that shaped the fate of World War II, the epic siege of Stalingrad in 1942-1943, where the Red Army turned the tide against the Nazis in an urban hell of ruins and starvation, the colossal Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history that broke the German momentum on the Eastern Front, and the Allied landing in Normandy in June 1944, D-Day, which opened the Second Front in Western Europe with bloodied beaches and paratroopers falling like deadly rain. What was unfolding in the far north went almost unnoticed, a secondary theatre eclipsed by the grandeur of the main fronts. No grand announcements echoed in Allied newspapers or Nazi propaganda. No flags were dramatically planted in the frozen ground in acts of symbolic triumph. No victories were celebrated in triumphal parades with fanfare and cheering crowds. Just a forgotten front, a peripheral war where men were consumed not by glory but by the devouring silence of the Arctic, a campaign that lasted from 1941 to 1945 and involved unstable alliances such as the Finnish-German co-belligerence against the Soviets, followed by the brutal turn of the Lapland War. In the isolated vastness of Lapland, there were no newsreel cameras capturing acts of heroism for posterity, no intrepid reporters sending dramatic dispatches from snowy trenches. Only soldiers immersed in a white and oppressive void, fighting a battle the world barely noticed, a front that cost some 100,000 German, Finnish, and Soviet lives, but which rarely figured in popular accounts. The Germans who, after the chaotic retreat, finally managed to reach Norway, crossing borders in forced marches that lasted weeks, evading Finnish patrols trained in Arctic guerrilla warfare, arrived unrecognizable, transformed by the ordeal into caricatures of themselves, beards frozen in blocks of ice that hung like stalactites, bodies weakened by malnutrition and scurvy that weakened bones and gums, eyes empty like bottomless wells, reflecting accumulated trauma. Many could no longer speak properly, their voices hoarse from the constant cold that irritated their throats. Others had lost fingers, feet, or parts of their faces to frostbite, improvised amputations performed in makeshift camps with knives heated over fires, cries muffled by the incessant falling snow. They were no longer soldiers of a powerful army, conquerors who had swept across Europe in lightning-fast blitzkriegs. They were survivors of a frozen hell that never quite made it into popular history books, a campaign obscured by the emphasis on more glorious fronts like North Africa or the Pacific, and the Finns, victorious in their pursuit that culminated in the Battle of Tornio in October 1944, one of the few conventional actions in the war where Finnish forces captured the port city in house-to-house fighting against entrenched Germans. They too were not celebrating with effusions of joy. Instead, they looked back and saw their north, devastated by the German scorched earth tactic, which destroyed more than 80% of the buildings in Rovaniemi and other villages, burning centuries-old wooden houses, blowing up mines and warehouses, leaving roads vanished in smoking craters and villages reduced to ashes that mingled with the snow like a funeral shroud. Lapland became a wounded land, a giant snow-covered scar where post-war reconstruction would take decades, with indigenous populations like the Sami losing reindeer herds vital to their cultural survival. This was not a front of heroes, mythologized in legends. It was a front of silent and brutal resistance, where the true enemy was the environment, which killed more than bullets. Estimates indicate that cold and exhaustion claimed up to 70% of German casualties during the retreat. There, at the end of the world, men did not fight for resounding glory, fiery speeches from distant leaders, or abstract ideals of racial superiority. They fought for one more day of miserable life, for a bit of warmth stolen from precarious fires that barely melted the ice on their uniforms, to avoid freezing to death, alone, in a vastness where the echo of a cry was instantly lost. And this primal struggle, devoid of romanticism, was perhaps more brutal than any famous battle, a terror that corroded the soul, the fear of being forgotten by the world, the frustration of a war without recognition, the dread that survival was a curse worse than death, the scars of ice, the human cost of the Arctic. When the last German columns, exhausted and decimated after the Battle of Rovaniemi in October 1944 and the subsequent skirmishes along the border, finally left Finnish territory in April 1945, coinciding with the final collapse of the Third Reich in Central Europe, the silence that settled in was not the balm of long-awaited peace, but a heavy and traumatized silence. A void laden with unburied corpses under layers of eternal snow and memories embedded in the burnt forests that smoldered like open wounds. The Arctic front, which stretched from the German invasion of Norway in 1940 to the Finnish-Soviet armistice in 1944, left scars not only on the devastated land, entire villages like Ivalo and Sodankylä reduced to rubble, nickel mines in Petsamo captured by the Soviets in October 1944, roads and bridges destroyed on a scale that paralyzed the local economy for years, but also on the men who by miracle or curse survived this ordeal. Finnish soldiers, veterans of the 1939-1940 Winter War against the Soviets and the 1941-1944 Continuation War, returned home on rickety trains or long marches, but they did not return whole, carrying not only invisible medals of endurance, but brutal amputations performed in field hospitals under the dim glow of lanterns, where saws crunched against frozen bones without proper anesthesia. Others carried something deeper and more insidious, the permanent cold within their minds, a psychological trauma that historians would later identify as a precursor to post-traumatic stress disorder, manifesting in recurring nightmares where the polar wind blew inside their skulls like a possessive demon, where they relived the ominous crack of ice breaking underfoot on night patrols, the guttural sound of comrades falling in ambushes and never getting up, their bodies swallowed by the snow as if the Arctic claimed them as tribute. Families, anxiously waiting in Helsinki or in hastily rebuilt villages, were reunited with men who could no longer smile, their faces marked by deep lines of eternal suffering, eyes that stared into the void as if they still saw the white horizon of terror. These veterans, even sitting near crackling campfires or in heated houses, felt an inner chill that no human warmth could dispel, waking at night in panic, convinced that they were still buried in deep snow during blizzards that lasted for days, their minds trapped in loops of frustration and fear. On the German side, the situation resonated with a similar bitterness. Those who survived the retreat and returned to Germany in 1945, many via Norwegian convoys or ships across the Barents Sea, found not heroism or a triumphant welcome, but ruins bombed by Allied campaigns, a country collapsing under the weight of imminent defeat, and within themselves an incessant internal battle, the struggle against the memory of comrades frozen in grotesque postures, of marches where the cold devoured fingers and hopes. The Arctic front claimed more than just lives. An estimated 15,000 Germans killed in the Lapland War alone, in addition to thousands of Finns and civilians affected. It claimed youth, leaving 20-year-olds aged like elders. It claimed dreams of a peaceful future, replacing them with visions of endless white. It claimed the future of thousands of men who disappeared without even having their names remembered in grand monuments, buried in mass graves, or simply lost in the tundra. And the snow, indifferent and eternal, continued to fall year after year, layer upon layer, as if trying to cover not only the rigid and forgotten bodies, but the very memory of that forgotten carnage, a terror that persisted, the fear that the scars would never heal, the frustration of a generation marked by an invisible war, the dread that the ice had forever stolen the ability to feel human warmth, the cold that never went away, the trauma that survived the war. Even after the last shots echoed in the north in April 1945, coinciding with the German surrender in Norway and the end of the war in Europe in May, even after the maps were redrawn in the 1947 Treaty of Paris, where Finland ceded Petsamo to the Soviets and paid heavy reparations, solidifying the post-war borders, and the treaties signed sealed a fragile peace, the Arctic did not return what it had taken with its glacial greed. For many men, the war never truly ended. It persisted as an inner spectre, an eternal winter that no armistice could melt. Because the cold wasn't just outside, confined to the tundras and forests of Lapland. It settled inside them, a psychological parasite that corroded their sanity day by day. Veterans of that front, both Finns who had fought on the Mannerheim Line during the Winter War and Germans from mountain divisions like the 20th Gebirgsarmee, carried for the rest of their lives a kind of winter that no boreal summer could dispel. It didn't matter if they were in rebuilt Helsinki, Berlin divided by the Allied powers, or in small Lappish villages raised from the ashes. Their bodies might be warmed by modern heaters or thick blankets, but their memories remained frozen in moments of horror. Ambushes in snowy valleys where blood froze before touching the ground, marches where the wind cut like blades, and the oppressive silence that followed the loss of an entire platoon to a sudden blizzard. Some could no longer bear the sound of the wind howling on autumn nights, evoking memories of patrols where the Arctic seemed alive and hostile. Others couldn't look at the gently falling snow without reliving the white corridors of terror where they had lost friends to slow frostbite, body parts amputated in makeshift surgeries, pieces of their souls shattered by utter loneliness. Many became as silent as ice, retreating to isolated lives where words seemed insufficient to describe the unspeakable. Others became irritable and explosive, unleashing accumulated frustration on broken families. Some lost themselves in drink, drowning memories in Finnish vodka or German schnapps, seeking oblivion in an alcoholic stupor. Others simply disappeared into themselves, living like hermits in remote cabins, their minds trapped in endless loops of dread. And the cruelest thing, what amplified the terror, was that front, as brutal as Stalingrad or the Ardennes in the 1944-1945 Bulge Offensive, didn't appear in the big Hollywood movies that glorified D-Day, in the resounding speeches of post-war leaders, in the best-selling books that narrated iconic heroes. For the world, it became a historical footnote, a marginal note in tomes about the Second World War. But for those who were there, the survivors who aged prematurely, marked by physical and mental scars, it became a lifetime of internal struggle. The Arctic front didn't create popular heroes immortalized in statues. It created broken men trying to survive in a world that no longer seemed real, where normality was a fragile illusion. Because when you face a winter that tries to kill you for days, weeks, months, a cold that killed more than bullets in a campaign that lasted 4 years, you never see life the same way again. Fear becomes a constant companion, frustration an eternal shadow, the dread that ice still lurks inside you, ready to freeze any glimpse of peace. The ice trial. When history begins to understand. For many years, entire decades marked by selective forgetting and the prioritization of grander, more accessible narratives, the Arctic front was treated as a mere minor detail, an insignificant footnote within the enormous and chaotic map of World War II, a conflict that engulfed entire continents in flames, destruction, and mythologized heroism. But with inexorable time, as dusty archives were reopened, surviving memories echoed in whispered testimonies, and scholars delved into the cold depths of forgotten records, historians began to look again at that remote and forgotten piece of the conflict, the icy. North of Finland, isolated Lapland, the merciless tundras where the sun hid for months, and understood with a belated and chilling clarity that something happened there that goes beyond traditional battles, something that transcended the clang of tanks and the roar of artillery, something that challenged the very essence of human warfare. There, in that white and unforgiving kingdom, where the wind howled like an ancient predator and the ice clung to the land like an eternal curse, it was not just a struggle between opposing armies, with contrasting uniforms and inflamed ideologies. It was a titanic battle against treacherous geography, against a voracious climate that devoured souls with sadistic patience, against the absolute and fragile limits of humankind, where bodies trained for violence succumbed not to bullets, but to the suffocating embrace of the cold that penetrated bones and minds. Northern Finland, with its skeletal forests of pine trees twisted by the constant wind, its narrow valleys squeezed between jagged mountains, and its frozen rivers that creaked like bones breaking under pressure, became a cruel and involuntary laboratory, a macabre experiment where military arrogance collided head-on with the unwavering reality of nature, exposing the futility of human ambitions in a theater of infinite pain. The Germans, imbued with a blind confidence in the technological superiority of the Third Reich, brought sophisticated machines, panzer tanks that had once crushed resistance in Poland and France, Opel trucks that cut through European roads with ruthless efficiency, 88mm cannons that spat death at unimaginable distances, ironclad discipline forged in the barracks of Berlin, and cutting-edge technology that promised to dominate any adversary. But the Arctic, indifferent and eternal, did not bow before such ostentation. It transformed everything into dead weight, into useless relics when the cold arrived like a silent leviathan, freezing engines into solid blocks of inoperable metal, when the roads disappeared under layers of snow that swallowed entire vehicles like voracious abysses, when darkness dominated the sky for endless weeks, plunging men into a suffocating darkness that corroded morale like slow acid, instilling a profound terror that the sun would never return. History, with its retrospective and merciless lens, began to see that front not as an isolated and peripheral failure, a mere marginal note in a war of global proportions, but as a symbol of something greater, deeper, and more terrifying. No empire, however vast and ambitious, can conquer nature in its most primal and hostile form. There, in the white expanses where man became insignificant like a solitary flake in an endless blizzard, the lessons were revealed in layers of accumulated frustration, the arrogance of distant leaders who underestimated the power of the ice, sending ill-equipped troops into an abyss where fine woolen uniforms proved useless against winds that cut like blades. The illusion that human will could subdue an environment that had existed for millennia before nations. Today, scholars and analysts, immersed in volumes of yellow diaries, torn maps, and confidential reports, Analyze that campaign as a direct and brutal lesson on flawed logistics, supplies that never arrived, routes blocked by unpredictable avalanches, convoys attacked by invisible partisans, on the devastating impact of the climate that claimed more lives than bullets, on the insurmountable limits of human power that dissolved into uncontrollable tremors and devouring gangrene, and on the strategic arrogance that led empires to ruin. A lesson written not in books bound with ink and paper, but in ice hardened like diamond, in blood frozen in red crystals, in snow that covered bodies like an eternal funeral shroud. And when you look at old photos from that time, grainy and faded images captured by cameras trembling in the cold, you see small, huddled men against an immense white, indifferent world. Their tiny silhouettes lost in infinite horizons, faces contorted in expressions of mute terror and profound frustration, and you understand with a shiver down your spine. There, the war was not won by anyone, not by the resilient Finns, nor by the tenacious Soviets, nor by the ambitious Germans. It was only survived in broken fragments of humanity by those few who emerged from the abyss, carrying scars that echoed the merciless judgment of the ice, a verdict that whispered the insignificance of man before primordial forces, instilling an eternal fear that any conquest would be illusory, a frustration that lingered like the echo of a howl in the polar wind. The white silence, where the war finally frozen. When it was all over, in the somber twilight of spring 1945, with the last German columns dissolving on the Norwegian border and peace treaties scribbled on distant papers, there was no celebration in that remote and forgotten corner of the world, no thunderous jubilation echoing across the frozen tundras. There were no crowds gathered in snowy squares, waving faded flags in triumph, no victory proclaimed with fiery speeches and artillery salvos. There was only silence, a vast and oppressive silence that stretched like a white veil over the wounded earth, stifling any echo of relief or hope. Northern Finland remained there, unshaken in its desolation, covered in snow that fell incessantly like frozen tears, wind that howled with possessive ferocity, and deep scars that would take decades to disappear, if they ever did completely. Charred villages whose ashes mingled with the ice like funereal dust, dynamited roads that snaked like open wounds across the landscape, burnt forests that stood like accusing skeletons against the grey sky. Where once columns of soldiers marched with forced determination, now only faded and ephemeral trails remained, footprints swept away by the wind like unwanted memories. Where once dry, gunshots echoed, tearing through the icy air, explosions that made the earth tremble like a giant awakening. Now the wind blew freely, indifferent and immense, carrying with it the whisper of ghosts that would never find peace. The men who survived, those few who emerged from the white abyss with scarred bodies and fragmented souls, followed different and tortuous paths, but all carried within them the same relentless winter, a winter with no end in sight that persisted like an inner curse even under distant summer suns. Some tried to forget, burying memories in monotonous routines of reconstruction, working in villages raised from the ashes with trembling hands that still felt the cold. Others wrote in hidden diaries, scribbling words that captured the terror of eternal nights and the frustration of a senseless war. Still others remained silent until the end of their lives, their empty gazes reflecting the white void that had swallowed them, unable to articulate the dread that gnawed at their insides. And the cruelest part, what amplified the frustration like an endless echo in the ice, is this. The ice swallowed not only rigid and forgotten bodies, preserved in grotesque postures under layers of eternal snow, but also entire stories, narratives of pain and resilience that dissipated in the wind like vapor, leaving a void where there should have been legends of survival. And perhaps for this reason, this front is so important to tell today, in an era where the world reflects on past wars with a comfortable distance, because there, at the end of the world, far from the great pulsating centers of power, far from the spotlights that illuminated Stalingrad or Normandy, far from the manufactured glory of parades and monuments, men discovered how small and fragile human beings are in the face of merciless nature, a revelation that instilled a deep and existential terror, a frustration that corroded the soul upon realizing that imperial ambitions dissolved like snow in the sun. How insignificant war, with all its fury and pretension, is compared to the inexorable flow of time. The cold that devours without remorse, the silence that swallows everything in its empty embrace. The Arctic front did not end with a resounding explosion, a dramatic climax of surrender and fireworks. It ended with a subtle and chilling whisper, the whisper of the wind passing through an empty field covered in pristine snow, over what remained of an army that once believed, in its blind arrogance, that it could dominate the entire world, leaving behind only echoes of terror, fragments of frustration, and an eternal dread that the white silence would still haunt them, a timeless reminder of human insignificance before primordial forces.